Is it working? Ooh. Est-ce que tout le monde m'entend? Bon, je peux pas voir les commentaires, donc Fabiola me dira si tout le monde m'entend. Test, test, micro. 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. Ah, po. Je vois qu'il y a des gens qui m'entendent, parce qu'il y a des commentaires déjà. Que quelqu'un peut juste me confirmer. Bonsoir à tous et à toutes, bien évidemment. Oui, Fatima Zahra, merci. Donc, je sais que vous m'entendez. Bonsoir à tous, bonsoir à toutes. Bienvenue sur ce RAS TV. Ce RAS TV un peu spécial, puisque d'habitude, les RAS TV, c'est en fait un live qui présente un projet qui sera ensuite présenté sur scène plus tard, vu que on fait essentiellement du théâtre ici. Mais aujourd'hui, on a un projet qui est de l'ordre du one shot, donc on a décidé de le construire entièrement sur live. Je vous en dis pas plus. Je vais d'abord vous faire une petite précision en ce qui concerne la langue du live. On a fait toute la communication en anglais et en français parce que on a un invité spécial aujourd'hui qui est anglophone. Donc la très grande majorité du live se fera en anglais. On va présenter des vidéos qui seront en français et en anglais, mais les interventions seront toutes en anglais. Donc j'espère que vous accrocherez et que ça vous plaira. Et maintenant, je passe la parole à Joachim.
Ok, merci Souhaila. Well, good evening, Assalamu alaikum. Hope everybody is well, healthy and warm, sitting close to their loved ones in the crazy times we are going through together. But it's a pleasure to be here and introduce to you Le Voyage de Salman, the journey of Salman. It's the first evening in a series of theater lectures on RAS TV that will tackle different questions from a critical Muslim perspective, a growing perspective in academia, but also in the public debate in Belgium and beyond. Inspired by a shared need to open up a space to explore possible relations between decolonial thinking and studies in Islam and the Islamic Gate, it's Ghent University and the Menarich Research Group, the Free University of Brussels, the Sheikh Fatima Mernissi, and the Catholic University of Leuven, the IMMRC, that are joining forces with the Brussels-based theater company Ras El Hanout. So, Souhaila, you want to add something?
No, you said Ras El Hanout, so my senses were like, oh, Ras El Hanout. It's me.
Yeah, but to understand how Islam is not only a religious and spiritual tradition, but also a possible framework for a decolonial perspective, we have invited different scholars in the field of critical Muslim studies. Tonight, we will speak with Salman Said, but next month with Maysoon Soukarieh, and later with Shireen Amir Moazami. So together with the professors of the three universities involved, Nadia Fadil, Iman Leshkar, and Sami Zemni, the theater company Ras El Hanout has prepared different theatrical intervention with a group and a collective that formed slowly a collective of young theater makers. So in the old normal, we would be sitting together in the artist-run place L'Épicerie in Molenbeek, but for the new normal, the theatrical interventions are pre-recorded and the talks are taking place, as you know, online. So, but I'm really curious to see what came out of the promising process, of which was a huge pleasure for me to take part in. So I give the word back to you, Souhaila.
So, donc moi, je vais faire la présentation en français. La présentation de Ras El Hanout, je vais un peu vous parler du processus artistique très rapidement, le processus qui a mené à la pièce qu'on va vous présenter aujourd'hui. Donc, Ras El Hanout, c'est une troupe de théâtre qui est basée à Molenbeek. Pour ceux qui ont déjà vu plusieurs RAS TV, vous nous connaissez un peu, et pour les nouveaux arrivants, bienvenue. Donc aujourd'hui, dans le cadre de ce projet, on a travaillé avec une petite équipe composée de Mariam, Shannon, Ayman, Myriam, big up à vous, je sais que vous regardez, autour donc des textes des différents auteurs que Joachim a présentés. Et là, on a travaillé autour du texte de Salman. Donc, il va rentrer en détail dans son texte qui est très scientifique, et on a essayé d'aller de créer quelque chose d'un peu farfelu, mais qui puisse tendre des perches à Salman pour creuser les différentes thématiques qui sont abordées dans son texte. Donc voilà, je vais maintenant laisser la parole à Nadia, qui va un peu se présenter. Voilà.
Voilà. Bonsoir à Sohaila, bonsoir à Joachim et bonsoir à toutes les personnes qui sont en ligne en train de nous regarder. Hein. Donc, mon nom c'est Nadia Fadel et je travaille à l'université de Leuven où je suis professeure. Et voilà, c'est vraiment un plaisir d'être là parmi vous hein, ce soir, car comme l'a expliqué Joachim et Sohaila, c'est un peu l'aboutissement d'un processus qui a déjà commencé au mois d'octobre, hein, la première fois qu'on s'est vu. Et donc, on a fait un travail collectif pour étudier des textes hein, par les différents personnes qui vont prendre la parole dans les semaines à venir, hein, donc Salman Saïd, Maïson Soukari et Shirin Amir Mouazami. Et donc, j'ai le plaisir aujourd'hui de vous introduire au travail de Salman, donc le voyage de Salman. Mais peut-être avant de commencer, je peux dire quelques mots sur qui est Salman Saïd. Hein. And I will then also switch to English for the English-speaking people, hein, so that you can also follow. Donc, Salman Saïd est professeur à l'université de Leeds. Et c'est aussi l'auteur de plusieurs ouvrages très importants dans le domaine des Critical Muslim Studies. Et on pourrait dire que c'est l'une des personnes clés dans ce champ émergent au niveau européen, qui a vraiment des pôles de recherche en Angleterre, aux États-Unis, mais aussi de plus en plus en Europe continentale. So, Professor Salman Saïd is a professor of rhetoric and decolonial thoughts at the University of Leeds, and also the head of School of Sociology and Social Policy at the same university. Ce qui est aussi important, c'est que Salman Saïd a vraiment joué un rôle important dans la création de ce réseau Critical Muslim Studies à travers la revue Reorient, Journal of Critical Muslim Studies, one of the founding editors of this journal. And he has also worked in Australia, has been the director of the Center for Muslim and Non-Muslim Understanding at the University of South Australia in Adelaide. Now, maybe some of you know the work of Salman Saïd. Pour d'autres, c'est encore tout à fait nouveau. Hein. Certains travaux de Salman Saïd, en tout cas l'un des premiers que moi j'ai lu, hein, j'ai eu le plaisir de découvrir son travail pendant mon travail de doctorat et qui a vraiment un impact important aussi sur ma trajectoire intellectuelle. One of his key, you could say, important books that has really shaped the field, you could say, is A Fundamental Fear, Eurocentrism and the Emergence of Islamism, published in 1997, et qui a été traduit en différentes langues, dont l'arabe et le turc. À côté de cela, il a encore publié d'autres bouquins hein, et aussi coédité avec Abdelkarim Vakil le bouquin Thinking Through Islamophobia. Thinking Through Islamophobia qui a été publié en 2010 hein, chez Hearst Publisher, un des ouvrages les premiers ouvrages, one of the first books, you could say, collections that addresses Islamophobia as a global phenomenon. Et à côté de cela, il est aussi l'auteur de Recalling the Caliphate, Decolonization and World Order, et aussi l'auteur de 2 bouquins qui vont apparaître bientôt, Islamism as Philosophy, Decolonial Horizons, and The Promise of Pakistan, qui vont tous les deux être publiés dans les prochaines années à venir, en tout cas, qui sont présentés pour 2022. Donc voilà, c'est un peu pour situer Salman Saïd. Hein. So Salman Saïd is a very important and prolific, you could say, writer. Besides these books, also has published many articles. and each of them somehow making an important and thought-provoking, you could say, contribution into the field of thinking about Islam, but also from this perspective of decoloniality, from a decolonial horizon. Donc la question qui se pose, c'est qu'est-ce que ça veut dire que de penser et de réfléchir la question de l'islam à travers un spectre décolonial. Et c'est la question qui va nous intéresser aujourd'hui. Que sont les Critical Muslim Studies et qu'est-ce qui fait qu'à un certain moment, Salman a commencé à travailler sur cette question. Donc voilà, je crois qu'on peut inviter notre hôte et je vous remercie, Zohaila et Joachim, pour les introductions.
Très bonne soirée.
Merci. Hi, Salman.
Hi, Nadia.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you for that generous.
How are things in Leeds and in the UK?
Oh, they are chaotic as everywhere else, I suppose, and it's just been a very long period of people are just thinking as like whether this will change ever and things like that. So yes, things go on. Yeah.
I mean, we're all afraid of the British corona variant, huh? So this is the kind of terror in Belgium. So,
I think it's the revenge of Brexit. I think that's how I think
probably.
you see it. Right? This is there.
Yeah, probably. That's the gift of the UK for Brexit, yeah. But we're not here to talk about Brexit. We're here to talk about your work. And so thank you again for, you could say, accepting this invitation to participate in this very experimental, you could say, for all of us, it's quite an experimental adventure. Huh? And so we're going to talk about your intellectual trajectory and the critical Muslim studies. And I also want to sincerely thank you for agreeing to lead us through your own journey and also to share, I could say, some in an exclusive manner, some stories about your past, right? Because as we will see immediately, the journey that you have gone through, your voyage, if you can say, is not entirely linear. And one of the questions I've always asked myself is to understand, so how come? I mean, where did you gain those ideas? How did you start producing this work? I think the first time that we met must have been somewhere in 2004 or 5. I don't recall exactly what year, but you were in Antwerp, which is quite interesting. Yes, you remember?
Of course I remember that. Yeah. That was the first time we met. Yeah,
and it was some kind of artistic festival, right?
It was about an exhibition on some sort of science fiction, and it was about it was a science fiction thing, and I was there. Yeah, I remember that. That was like kind of close there.
And I remember you were giving a talk about Dune, the movie, and how we should read that. So. And I think, I mean, for me, it was already quite intriguing, like, how does this work together, right? How does Islam and science fiction work together? And maybe you can tell us more about that. But it says also something about how your work has always been influenced by intertextual references to science fictions, also scenes from a different dimension. Is there maybe a reason for that? And can you say more about that?
I think it's really, I mean, for me, it's been always interesting because one of the things I've always wondered about is why I've been interested in not just science fiction, but speculative fiction. And the only answer I have, and it's not a very profound one, is that it's always been a concern of mine to imagine the world otherwise. And these are the kind of possibilities that one has to imagine the world otherwise, which exist in a kind of a public domain. So when you don't have the intellectual or cultural resources to imagine something beyond the present, these give you the possibilities. And what attracted me to Dune is the kind of inflection of this influence of the Islamic Gate throughout this in a very kind of mainstream, popular kind of fiction, but how that created certain kinds of tensions in how we can tell the future. So one of the main things, of course, was at that time, the idea of religion in the future was always a question mark, because if you believe the secularist thesis, religion would be a superstition that would die out. So that was the first thing. But then to imagine Islam in the future, in the distant future, but not just as a memory, but as something significant, well, that's kind of really, really intriguing. And I was just surprised that there wasn't why that wasn't seen as being more interesting than it was. And sometimes here, I think it's the main lesson I would say to you is this, is that I'm not sure Frank Herbert necessarily would do the same reading. Therefore, when you watch these things about the voyages of Salman, we should always remember, trust the tale, not the author. And there's a kind of a fictionalized account in all of these things, which I think should make us wary, but also aware of the trap of objectifying these things. So I think that's something that
But so to come back to that voyage, I think we want to immediately maybe start with that voyage. And I think what you said also, this kind of speculative and experimental thinking. And I think throughout your biography, you have also experienced some very special things, right? And I think Ras Al Hanoud has managed to find some archives about your own past, right? That you have generously agreed to share with us. And so,
archives of a past, a version of various
a past.
pasts.
Yeah. I mean, yes, we will say this is the kind of archive that Ras Al Hanoud has made of your past. And so maybe I suggest that we start by looking at this first piece of archive that has been found. So maybe we could look at this first clip.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Ah, excuse-moi, j'ai été retenue par un étudiant. Viens, entre. Alors, comment ça va? Tu as travaillé sur ta problématique?
Oui, du coup j'ai travaillé dessus et je me suis dit que j'aimerais travailler sur l'islam politique.
Oh, très intéressant. Tu sais dans quelle direction tu veux aller? Ah, je suppose que tu as déjà consulté des auteurs comme Gilles Kepel, Jean-Paul Barnet ou Jacques Berck. Ils ont travaillé sur le sujet.
Oui,
oui, et comme tu as pu le voir, tout le monde a quelque chose à dire sur le sujet. Il y a toujours un article ou l'autre sans aucune base empirique. Comme ça a été beaucoup étudié, il faut vraiment que tu apportes quelque chose d'original et de sérieux.
Oui, du coup j'ai consulté pas mal d'articles, notamment ceux de Talal Assad et de Brian Kepler, qui m'ont permis de réfléchir sur la fin du califat. Et j'aimerais vraiment comprendre en fait les politiques, le monde politique dans les pays musulmans, notamment les questions liées aux politiques islamiques, islamistes, non islamiques. Donc voilà.
Oui, Talal Assad est intéressant, mais il faut faire attention. Tu devrais plutôt consulter des auteurs avec des approches plus classiques, plus scientifiques. Oui, parce que bon, Talal Assad, ses méthodes ont été un peu critiquées et son approche n'est pas très claire. Hein. Quant à sa méthodologie, elle s'éloigne un petit peu de celle des auteurs classiques. Et pour beaucoup, son travail est considéré plus comme un témoignage plutôt que comme un travail vraiment sérieux.
Ah oui, mais j'ai vu qu'il était pris au sérieux par des spécialistes, notamment Burga. De plus, je trouve que sa méthode est quand même, somme toute, assez classique. Enfin, je dirais même au contraire que...
Écoute, je t'arrête tout de suite parce que Burga n'est pas vraiment neutre. Il a passé beaucoup trop de temps sur le terrain pour être objectif. Non, il faut que tu ailles voir vraiment les approches plus classiques et plus scientifiques, des auteurs qui ont plus de recul pour... Oui, parce que dans ton cas, la prudence doit être double. Hein.
La quoi, pardon?
Dans ton cas, la prudence doit être double.
Pourquoi?
Tu n'es pas vraiment en position de prendre des risques.
Des risques?
Va voir les auteurs avec des méthodes classiques et scientifiques pour pallier à ta subjectivité intrinsèque.
Ma subjectivité intrinsèque? Je veux dire, en quoi serais-je moins objectif qu'un autre?
Écoute, il est vraiment primordial que tu revoies les bases méthodologiques, classiques et scientifiques, hein, et pour pouvoir prendre du recul avec ton objet de recherche, parce que dans ton cas, c'est un petit peu plus ardu, hein.
Excuse-moi, Patricia, on avait bien rendez-vous aujourd'hui.
Oh, Salman, j'avais oublié, mais je vais en finir, hein, parce que... Oh, oui. On va finir pour aujourd'hui. Pour la prochaine fois, allez bien voir les méthodes classiques, hein, et travaillez bien sur la distance avec l'objet. D'accord?
Ouais.
Allez.
Au revoir.
À bientôt. Oh, avec cette doctorante, c'est toujours la même chose. J'ai l'impression qu'il faut tout reprendre à zéro. Je le vois bien me ramener du Saïd ou du Spivak, comme si c'était des travaux sérieux. Alors qu'il y a des auteurs, comme Touraine par exemple, eh bien, on travaille depuis longtemps avec leurs méthodes et ils n'ont plus rien à prouver.
Mais on sait quelque chose, j'ai eu le coup récemment avec l'une de mes étudiantes. On en a toujours un ou deux par année, ce genre de spécimens, des espèces de révolutionnaires qui sont persuadés de pouvoir remettre en cause toutes les bases de la méthodologie. Mais par exemple, tu vois, la conférence que j'ai organisée sur le djihadisme en Afghanistan, eh bien, figure-toi que des étudiants m'ont reproché de ne pas avoir invité d'intervenants afghans. Ils sont incroyables, ils ne comprennent pas qu'on choisit nos intervenants sur base de leurs compétences et pas de leur origine. Et ils sont persuadés de pouvoir faire du bien à la société avec leurs idées complètement séparatistes.
Oh, et on est censé être dans les années 90, hein. Oh, m'en parle pas.
Okay, so this is quite an intriguing piece of work. So what happens here, Salman?
Well, I think this is a scene that anyone who is a person of color, anyone who's a Muslim, anyone who's ever been marked out should be able to relate to that. It is a version of this scene is probably played out all the time. You go in there and you want to do some work and you find out that you are now becoming the ethnographic subject. So I think that is partly the impetus for critical Muslim studies, but it's also been impetus for the work that I've been doing is trying to avoid inscription as an ethnographic subject. There is a biographical detail.
What do you mean by that, by inscription as an ethnographic subject?
Well, I'll give you an example what I mean by that. It was that when my first manuscript was finished, which became Fundamental Fear, the publishers, in their zeal to get people to write a blurb, they sent it to a relatively famous American anthropologist who decided not to just write the blurb, but decided to comment on the manuscript. And his commentary on the manuscript was, well, I expected something more about the experience of being a Muslim in the time, and there's nothing there. There is not, there's simply a kind of a very theoretical work, and there's nothing about the ethnography, there's nothing about the experience of Muslims living in Britain and elsewhere, etc. He doesn't really tell a story about himself. And I've always kept that piece because they said, you know, so therefore he couldn't write the blurb for this. But the reason why I always kept that letter is because it's always been strike me is that this is the idea that there's a kind of a division of labor in academia, but also within a public space, where we provide the empirical ethnographic detail, and then the theoretical and conceptual work and universal work or generalizable work is done elsewhere. And you see this in so many different manifestations of that experience. So inscription as an ethnographic subject is basically that instead of talking to you, Nadia, about your ideas, I start talking to you about your experiences. And I start talking to you about not your experiences as you want to talk about them, but your experiences that I want to hear and turn into something for me to understand. So the question always for you know, for Muslim women or women who may have some tinged with Muslimness would always become a certain tropes of questions that would come in, like do you or do you not wear the hijab? Why do you or do you not do this? Similarly for Muslims. So there are set questions that become the real matter, but they may not be questions which are particularly pertinent to one's life. They may or may not be, or one's experience. So I think that's what I mean by the ethnographic exhibit, and I think that's the fate. And that's not just in academia or in school, but I would say in public life as well, that
But
you are there to provide details.
But does it then mean that Muslims should not talk about their experience? Because I of course agree with what you say and hear what you say, and that there is, I mean, a Muslim woman is all about how emancipated she is and how oppressed she is, and so there is nothing else that to a certain extent counts. But there is also that other, you could say, movement that we see within, you could say, critical studies, like within the feminist movement, where it's all about starting from your own experience to start to theorize, right? That because of your experience, you understand the world in a particular way, and you can think about the world in a particular way. So how do you see that working?
But that's, I think, very, very different, because it's about the articulation of your own experience. But before you can actually articulate your experience yourself, you have to have a language that you can use it. And the challenge often will not allow us to talk about our experiences in any way which is meaningful. So there will always be this tension. So yes, white feminism is very, very clear about this. Talk from the experience of being through your own experience. But the experience of whiteness is hegemonic. So there is a huge vocabulary that exists for it to be able to be expressed. Speaking through your own experience, when you have to construct the language through which you can speak that experience, is a far more formidable challenge. And I think it's important to recognize that. I mean, just to give you one simple example, and I don't want to belabor the point, take the very simple word religion. How should a Muslim talk about religion or talk about Islam? The easiest thing to do is, let's say, religion, and forget about it. But that doesn't really work. So you can say, well, you know what, we can talk about deen, and deen translates into religion. And then we can say something like, well, religion is for Islam is a total way of life. None of these take into account that Islam only became a religion once the concept of religion emerged to do certain types of work, in the late 19th century, really. And before that, if you look, for example, in the first English translations of the Quran, they don't translate deen into religion because the concept of religion didn't exist. They translate it into sacred law. Now, if you have a translation of deen into sacred law or into law, you have a very different understanding of what Islam may be. So even in a very ordinary word, which everyone understands and uses, has certain traps or opportunities and possibilities, which I think we need to explore to be able to narrate our own experiences.
Okay. So in a sense, I think the young Salman was looking for answers and was looking. I mean, that's what we see also in that video. This quest for this first clip. Where you're discussing with your supervisor who wants to push you in a particular direction, this question of objectivity, this idea that Muslim researchers should be more careful, especially if they work on Islam. How did your trajectory continue? Because from what I understood, it's not really a linear trajectory, and at some point you start making some time jumps, right, into another moment. And I think this is also what the next archive or the next clip is going to address. So maybe we could briefly look at it, and then we return and continue.
Promotrice, vraiment.
voilà donc Monsieur Saïd. Bonjour Mesdames et Messieurs. Aujourd'hui, nous allons passer au panel des questions sur le Moyen-Orient. Tout d'abord, j'aimerais un tonnerre d'applaudissements pour Monsieur Salman Saïd. Asseyez-vous, s'il vous plaît. Que l'on remercie pour sa présence, ainsi que pour Monsieur Zazou, célèbre homme de lettres. La question est la suivante. Monsieur Zazou, vous avez été victime de nombreuses accusations suite à votre prise de position sur le printemps arabe. Peut-être voudriez-vous revenir dessus et un peu les éclairer? Ensuite, nous donnerons la parole à Monsieur Saïd afin qu'il réagisse et pourquoi pas ouvrir un débat au vu de ce que vous avez écrit dans vos articles, qui étaient d'ailleurs très intéressants. Monsieur Zazou.
Des articles, moi?
Le fait est que nous sommes hypocrites en Occident. Mais ça, tout le monde le sait, on l'a toujours été. Moi, ce que je trouve intéressant et important, c'est la manière avec laquelle nous le sommes. Voyez-vous, l'Occident est hypocrite car il a passé des années et des années et des années à répéter le seul moyen de rassembler les Arabes et de le faire au travers de l'antisémitisme, de la religion ou du fanatisme. Si seulement on pouvait voir émerger un pouvoir séculier et démocratique. Et maintenant que l'on en voit un, on a peur de ce changement et de ses conséquences. Ce qui se passe au Moyen-Orient ne devrait pas être vu comme un mouvement pro-occidental.
Excusez-moi.
Taisez-vous! Absolument pas. Mais pourquoi aurions-nous peur de ce qui se passe durant ce printemps arabe alors que ces gens se battent pour un régime où islam et politique sont séparés? Et en ce qui concerne l'Égypte, il est clair et évident que l'armée égyptienne et les frères musulmans finiront par construire une coalition ensemble. Car en y regardant de plus près, on le voit bien, ils partagent les mêmes intérêts et sont politiquement proches à droite.
Des réactions, professeur Saïd?
Oui. Professeur. Alors, Monsieur Zazou. Ah, Monsieur Zazou. Donc, comme il le dit si bien, l'hypocrisie, vous savez, d'un point de vue des normes sociales ou même identitaires, c'est-à-dire que, en fait, c'est une question d'épistémologie. Vous savez, l'herméneutique, tout ça. Mais d'une certaine manière, en fait, c'est un problème de conjecture réellement, et au vu des différents éléments dont nous disposons, je pense que on serait à même de dire que l'Égypte, il s'avérerait que l'Égypte se trouve face à une situation, disons, totalement historique et vice versa.
Oh, merci pour cette opinion éclairante. C'est donc sur ces belles paroles que...
On n'en parle encore.
Okay, so this is quite intriguing. So in the previous clip, you were still trying to identify a topic for your thesis, and in this clip, you are projected in 2011, where you talk with Mr. Zazou about the Arab Spring and the events in Egypt. What's going on there and what's happening?
I think what Salman is experiencing is two things there. One is obviously the way in which the Arab Spring is reappropriated for a narrative which confirms that the future of the world, the future world history is Westernization wherever. Because what was comforting about the Arab Spring, or it was the way it was presented, was this idea that we have people who are wired up, wearing jeans, young people going and are overthrowing tyranny, and therefore eventually that means they will overthrow the idea of Islam. And there was still a kind of a crisis because a lot of the commentary would say things like, this is a very secular movement, there are young people here, etc., who are not really interested in religion, but we don't know how big the crowd is going to be until after Jummah prayers. Now, obviously, if it's a secular movement, the Jummah prayers would have no significance on the crowd. So it just seemed quite curious. I think the other thing, of course, was that the way a certain kind of dialogue, a certain kind of presentation, a certain perspective simply has never given time or to ever explain anything. And I think you see that more and more. This thing about being told to shut up or being running out of time, the northern version of that now is legislation or pressure in the United States, in France, in Britain, that, for example, post-colonial studies or critical race studies or these things really need to not be taught at the universities. So we're reaching a very interesting historical conjuncture where the idea of the freedom of expression or academic freedom, which in the days of the Cold War was one of the hallmarks of what it meant to be Western and free, is now being slowly edged and erased or weakened. So it becomes more and more subject to other logics. And we have so many examples of that. And in a way, the Arab Spring and the narration around the Arab Spring is just a very good way of representing these issues. When you march hand in hand, sorry, I'll finish here. When you march hand in hand with dictators in favor of press freedom, you kind of have lost the plot in a way, and no one can take you seriously anymore.
Yeah. So what we've seen here, to be very clear, is I think it's a citation. So Dr. Zazou is a citation from Slavoj Žižek, with whom you take also issue in one of your articles. So this is also what the clip is referring to. But if I understand you correctly, so what you're saying is that the way we imagine and the way we think about the Arab Spring and the kind of narration that is, and that was also your critique on Zizek's account, it's very relevant to talk about it now, because now we're also, you could say, celebrating the 10 years of Tahrir, is very much through a secular democracy lens, hence also the suspicion towards any other kind of movements, or whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood or others, and the idea that maybe it could not take that direction, right? And it's maybe something else that is happening, something that Ahram at some point also described as an asecular moment, Tahrir as an asecular moment, not as a secular moment, but an asecular moment. And so what you're saying is that it's very difficult actually to tell those other stories, right? So just also to rehearse.
Yeah, sorry, this is the key point here. What is really in Zizek's, I mean, look, Zizek says lots of things, and sometimes he's right, so sometimes he's wrong. It's a kind of very scattered approach. And I have a lot of affection for some of the things he says, a certain panache that he says them with. But the real key thing is this: is it possible for us to imagine the idea of freedom, which doesn't start off by already predicating the idea of the Enlightenment or the idea of the West? Is it possible for us to start from somewhere else to think about freedom? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the real question for us. Because if freedom only means that the only way you can think about freedom is through a particular lens or through a particular history, then I think it's very, very challenging.
Mm-hmm. No. Now, we travel to the future, but we've also found footage where you travel to the past. And so maybe I think we could maybe look at that, because I think this touches also upon another important moment that you comment upon in your work. So I suggest we immediately watch together.
Messieurs, je viens vous annoncer que les botanistes et les astronomes sont prêts à partir. Messieurs, je viens vous annoncer que que les botanistes et les astronomes sont prêts à partir. Les chimistes et les géomètres sont en train de préparer leur besace. Mais nous avons un petit problème, il semblerait. Monseigneur, votre grandeur, votre importance.
Qu'y a-t-il? Parlez donc.
Eh bien, en fait, les horlogers sont un petit peu en retard sur le planning. Ils ne pourront pas nous rejoindre avant un jour ou deux. Et aussi, il manque quelques officiers à l'appel.
Pour une mission d'une telle importance, tout se doit d'être parfait. Le moindre petit élément indésirable que nous tolérerions risquerait de ralentir, de malmener, voire d'entraîner un échec humiliant pour la France. Que l'histoire retiendra-t-elle de Napoléon Bonaparte?
Napoléon? Monsieur?
Tant d'honneur, je pourrais bien m'y habituer. Monsieur Puma? Qui est-ce?
Il s'agit du nouvel officier.
C'est ça, c'est bien ça.
Il est là pour nous aider à terminer à temps. Voilà, officier Puma.
Jean Puma, 3e du nom.
Drôle d'accoutrement, officier Puma. Il va nous aider à arriver à bon port au Caire.
Parfait. L'Égypte est à portée de main.
L'Égypte? Faut pas que Napoléon arrive en Égypte. Je dois l'en empêcher. Il n'y va pas seulement pour la conquête militaire, mais aussi avec tous ses scientifiques. S'il y parvient, il aura la main mise sur la production du savoir. Et ça va avoir des répercussions sur tout ce qui suit. Jusque maintenant, jusque dans les années 90. Édouard, c'est pour toi que je fais ça. Mais monsieur, nous ne pouvons pas embarquer en Égypte avec un effectif aussi réduit. Enfin, je veux dire, s'il vous plaît, cela nuirait grandement. Enfin, ce ne serait pas digne de votre ambition si ambitieuse. Prenez par exemple le géographe Beauchamp. Beauchamp, il a dû rentrer en France car sa femme allait accoucher.
Beauchamp sera pendu.
Et les cartographes.
Fourier?
Celui-là même, oui, il s'est noyé durant la traversée.
Fourier sera pendu.
Et le médecin et généraliste Dobrand a été assassiné en Sicile.
Dobrand sera
Pendu.
Monsieur, messire, ce brave homme est venu vous dire que la moitié de l'effectif manque. Nous n'allons pas tous les citer.
La moitié de l'effectif considère donc que cette mission historique n'est pas suffisamment importante pour ne serait-ce que daigner se présenter.
Nous ne pouvons pas embarquer avec un effectif aussi réduit.
Clairement.
Il nous faut un nouvel effectif.
Il faut que nous rentrions en Paris.
Et si nous allions prendre un petit verre?
Un dernier petit verre avant d'arriver sur la terre des Mahométans? Bah oui, évidemment.
Laissez-moi vous servir. Monsieur.
À l'année 1798, à notre gloire future, à la conquête d'Égypte. Auteur. On a voulu m'empoisonner, il sera pendu!
Non. Oui.
Wow, what a journey. My God. So even meeting Napoleon himself.
He was only Bonaparte those days.
I'm sorry? He was sorry?
He was only Bonaparte in those days.
yes, absolutely. So why was it important to travel to that moment? What happens in that moment?
I think when Salman was Jean Puma III, I think there was a moment of recognition that the events of 1798 are really, really interesting. There are two kind of dates. There's 1492 or there's 1798. If 1492 is the beginning of the decolonial, then 1798 has always been the beginning of the post-colonial. Both of the 1798, I think, is not, and I think it says quite clearly that what we have is not just an army of conquest, but an army of knowledge production. And in a sense, this is the beginning of the way in which Islam begins to be written, not for itself, but by someone else. And I think that's the real crucial moment. And when and you can see that the time machine doesn't have a very good braking system, so you just fall into place rather than elegantly landing in there. But the idea would have been this, that we have, goes back to what we talked about speculative fictions. Are there moments in time where you think things could be different? I think it's really, really important that we hold on to the idea that history is contingent and these contingent moments exist. Because one of the most depressing and pressing elements of a hegemony is to demonstrate that everything is necessary, that the history as it is, it was inevitable. Napoleon was inevitable. The various colonialism was inevitable. Imperialism was inevitable. And by demonstrating that there's contingency, you open up the possibility, go back to what I said before, that things could be otherwise. And then it's a question of our imagination and courage.
And I think that's what that scene tries to show, right? That scene that young Salman is trying to change the course of history, because by changing that, it would also mean changing the whole history of colonialism, you could say, in the Middle East as it will unfold with France, you could say, being the first major force and power that enters into what was still then part of the Ottoman Empire, and that would then lead also to the demise of those different part of the world, you could say, and the entry of modernity and technology, and also of Orientalism. And this is also an important moment where Edward Said, there is also reference to Edward by Jean Puma, who also mentions this moment as an important key moment where knowledge from the West, for the West, on the Orient becomes produced, right?
Absolutely.
Which is, of course, not completely new, because there was already some knowledge on the Muslim lands, but this becomes a new kind, modern scientific knowledge, right?
I think it's the newness of that knowledge. It's the knowledge which is it's knowledge that grows out of the barrel of a gun. That's really quite interesting and quite different in a sense. And the younger Salman, or Jean Puma, as he was known at the time, perhaps was keenly aware of these moments of these tensions. Now, if history can be changed in these moments, or maybe what it needs is not one Jean Puma or one, but maybe hundreds of Jean and Jeanne Pumas to actually start doing historical work, because historical work is the only way that we can make things better for all of us.
Yeah. Well, I think we're slowly arriving at the end of the archive that we found about all these fascinating travels through time, and you have also, at the end of this voyage, you could say, ask yourself those questions. And I suggest we look at this final, you could say, piece of archive that we found, and then conclude.
Mai 1990. Je suis de retour à mon époque. Les autres vont pas croire quand je vais leur raconter tout ça. Si je peux faire des bons de temps comme ça, je me demande bien ce que je peux faire d'autre. Peut-être que je peux voler. Je sais pas voler. Peut-être que... Ouais, non, c'est con. Peut-être que je peux invoquer mon moi du futur. Je suis sûr que lui, il saura répondre aux questions que je me pose. Je suis sûr que si je me concentre un petit peu... Salman, je t'invoque. Tu es moi? Non, c'est pas possible. J'ai dû faire une erreur quelque part, je pense. Je vais réessayer, hein, parce que ça doit sûrement pas être ça. Allez, concentre-toi. Ah ouais. J'ai pris un sacré coup de vieux, hein. Non, c'est pas possible. C'est pas possible, ça doit pas être moi. Je réessaye encore une fois. Hein. C'est bon, j'ai compris. Je dois moi-même répondre aux questions que je me pose, comme d'habitude. Mais... comment faire? Peut-être que ma promotrice a raison quand elle dit que je suis trop biaisé que pour faire de la recherche. Puis, est-ce qu'un musulman peut vraiment faire de la recherche sur des questions liées à l'islam ou aux musulmans? Puis c'est quoi un musulman au final, hein? Je veux dire, l'islam, l'islamisme, c'est quoi la neutralité, l'objectivité? Est-ce que la pensée décoloniale est vraiment compatible avec la recherche? Comment faire? Qui a raison au final? Tant de questions qui se bousculent dans ma tête et quand j'y repense, j'ai même pas pu arrêter Napoléon, et même si j'avais réussi, c'est un impérialiste comme les autres. Si ça n'avait pas été lui, ça aurait sûrement été un autre. Peut-être même un impérialiste musulman. Puis, on part toujours du même point de vue, mais... et si on adoptait d'autres lunettes? Par où commencer?
So the young Salman, who actually looks like you, I must say, is speaking to the older Salman. So where do we stand now, and how do you go beyond it? And I think it goes back to what you said about these speculative imaginaries, and maybe the work you've been trying to do also through your own intellectual trajectory and oeuvre, but also with critical Muslim studies. Can you say maybe a bit more about that?
I think critical Muslim studies is really a response to all of the clips that we've seen. It is really a response to having those incidents in the first clip and imagining what could be possible in the second clip, and then a kind of a third kind of reflective clip about really what are the kind of answers. And the key then is really to move away from a importation or dependency on a language which basically makes it very, very difficult for people of color or for Muslims to actually speak about themselves and tell their own stories or tell their own history. So critical Muslim studies is really an acknowledgement of that. There is a tendency that, you know, throughout these clips, there's been sort of the shadow of the work of Edward Said, but really the shadow of the critique of Orientalism, which a number of people were involved in. And there is a kind of an attitude to Orientalism which says something like this, and a lot of people, and again, in the professor or the promoter, you know, caught that yes, that was written in 78, 79. It was very interesting, but nobody does Orientalism anymore. Everyone in graduate school in America has read the book and wears the T-shirt, and they don't do Orientalism. But reading a book is not the same as actually working through what the book says. any Muslim should know this, as after they may have read the Quran, but being a Muslim or trying to be a good Muslim is not the same as being able to read the Quran. In the same way, so there is a question about reading and then living. And the challenge, I think, is really this, that everyone can say, yes, yes, we've done Orientalism, but now let's just carry on doing that. But if you really take Orientalism or the critique of the possibilities of Orientalism seriously, then you have to say that the production of knowledge itself is haunted by the specter of the Orient. The trace of the Orient is there in everything that we do. And unless we take that seriously and reflect on the implications of that, our knowledge is always going to be caught in this trap where it doesn't make sense for many, many people. But more dangerously, we are now, I would argue, living in a sort of post-Western stage in many ways. But as long as our vocabulary and our understanding remains embedded in these Western technologies and techniques, and there is no longer Western power to make them into a reality, we now have the disjunction, but what we can describe, what we experience, and what is out there. And that is the source of great unhappiness and great harm to many, many Muslims across the planet. And I would argue from that, not just Muslims, it becomes great harm to everyone in the planet, not just people of the global south, but also people of the global north. Because the real impetus here is that the process of decolonization has to be deepened, not abandoned. And the decolonization has to reach the metropole, both at a kind of a political, juridical level, but most importantly, epistemological and cultural level. We need to be able to live beyond white privilege and white supremacy.
But what does it mean exactly to decolonize Islam in that regard? Because I mean, I think one part of what you say is to say, well, we should be mindful and understand how that colonial imaginary and legacy has seeped into Islam. And I mean, I'm thinking of the word the Islamic State. Very much the idea of a state is on itself a very colonial and modern idea. But also, how can you remove yourself from that? Because it's very much part also, I mean, in the meantime, it has very much become part of our language, right? I mean, we speak in English with each other, right? We live in Europe, we read, I mean, your work is also informed by Western scholarship. So what does that mean exactly?
I think this is really a key question. There are many, many concepts that we use which are now identified as having a particular tinge of Westernness. So, for example, the notion of the state. Yeah, you can go back to Weber and you can go back to the people writing in the 17th century and say that the state is a Western invention. Now, my people, the Sumerians, would say that the state is their invention. They were the first ones to invent a state, and we can play these games all the time. Who invented the state? But the thing is that there's not a question about finding out who invented the state, which is important, but really it is the understanding the field of contested genealogies. So
what
if
is
you think,
contested genealogies?
I
That's
think
maybe
the
a
idea,
complicated term.
well, I guess what I'm trying to say is this, that the easiest example always comes to my mind is if I was going to tell you that computing, the internet and everything depends on binary numbers, and binary numbers depend on the invention of zero. So the Romans could never have invented computers because they didn't, unless they invented the zero. I mean, this is a basic argument, right? So therefore, it follows that because the Indians invented the zero, they invented Google or made the condition possible. Now, you could say this is absurd, but it's no more absurd than half the history books written which make those kinds of jumps all the time. The history of the world is told in these little steps where you go from Greeks, Romans, Renaissance to modern Europe, and everyone just falls into that. So what I mean by contested genealogies is really this ability to tell different stories in different beginnings. And it's no more absurd to say this is a good point to begin or another point to begin. Or if you wanted to tell the biography of Salman, where would you start? Or even the biography of Nadia, where does it begin? If I wanted to write your biography, should I begin with you or your parents, your grandparents? How far can we go? There is no logical point that you would say to me, no, 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 you could only begin with my parents. You cannot tell me the story of the migration to Belgium. You cannot tell the story. That's not my biography, but easily it could be your biography.
Yeah. So is what you're saying that decolonizing Islam also means understanding these different genealogies and these different constitutive elements that make the Ummah and you could say the global imaginary, if we could use that term.
No, I think it's exactly what I mean. I think what I'm trying to say here is this, that what the Ummah is now, it certainly wasn't what it may have been 200 years ago, 300 years ago, or in the 7th century. And when people say that, there is always, many Muslims feel very defensive about this, like it's somehow inauthentic. But I don't think there's any need to feel defensive about it at all. We know as an empirical fact, and here I go becoming a positivist for a moment, there are more Muslims alive now than there've ever been. I mean, that's just true. And it's not just, they're far more widespread. So in a sense, there is this kind of tradition or this idea that, and I think it's an Orientalist trope, but also a classical Islamic trope, in which the first generation was the best and everything else was a slow decline. Now, this may have a certain moral function, but I don't think it necessarily has a historical function. And we should be able to tell these different stories around that, because there are people better than us or worse than us who had to cope with more than us or less than us. Mm-hmm. So it's just a kind of recovery of these different stories. And I guess the decolonization element is this, to recognize that the processes which led to the world being made in this way are not the shape of the world itself. And that's the beginning of that kind of conversation, that these things that we take for necessary are simply contingent.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think we can now slowly maybe move to the question and answer part. I don't know whether there are any questions. I mean, I do still have some questions, but I will put them on hold because I'm very curious to see whether there are any questions for the audience. Yes, I see a question from Kautar. Thank you, Kautar. So she says, fascinating, the idea of the Ummah would then be a form of resistance to the invention of the state. Is that what you're saying? So she asks, can we think about the idea of the Ummah as, you could say, a type of resistance to the idea of the state?
I would say that the Ummah is a type of resistance to the idea of the nation state. I would say that to think about the Ummah or to be conscious of the Ummah means that you have to think transnationally in today's vocabulary. And that means all of us have to weaken our nationalist holding onto the national state to embrace the Ummah. And that's a very complicated thing, because there's a lot of effectiveness in how the nation state constructs itself, from allegiances to football teams to allegiances to cuisine.
So just to clarify, the nation state, l'État-nation, is the countries, France, the UK, Morocco, Turkey. So these are the basic models of the nation state, right? Just to clarify.
Yeah. So I'm not talking about the state itself, because I think that's a slightly more complicated picture. But I certainly think the idea of the nation state, where you argue that the only meaningful political community is the one which is bound by the idea of a nation, which of course we know is invented, and then it has political powers. And in every single instance, from China to France, from Trump to Macron, which is not such a large walk anyway, you have the attempt to nationalize the Muslim. And wherever you have that, you have tyranny. And I think that's the main challenge. So I would say the Ummah and the notion of the nation state have a certainly tense relationship, or should have a tense relationship.
And in that sense, Islam is not an exception, right? Because I think we see that also within Christianity. I mean, the historical rivalry that has existed between, you could say, the Catholic Church and the European states in that regard, right?
I think the Catholic Church is only the weakening of the Catholic Church which allowed the kind of nation states to emerge. And the nation states in Europe, many of them, they emerge in the conflict against the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church's limit on its ability to make universal claims. So I think that's true. And whatever I say about Islam is not about the exceptionality of Islam. It's simply a recognition of its specificity. And I think we have to guard against exceptionality and banalization as well.
But of course, the difference is that the Catholic Church still has a central authority, right? With the Pope and
Yes, but there are many, many differences. I mean, I think the biggest thing is this, and nothing I say should be an advocate. We don't need a Muslim Pope, though I do think when someone is anointed a Muslim Martin Luther, the temptation should always be to ask, where's the Muslim Pope? Because there is no Muslim Pope, so we don't really need a Muslim Martin Luther either, really. It's a very, very different arrangement, and we need to recognize that arrangement for being different. There was a recent conversation in Britain where in Britain they've elected the leader of the largest Muslim organization, just elected a Muslim woman. And the first question, and this is not a spiritual organization, and one of the questions,
the Muslim Council of Britain, right?
Yeah. They elected Zara Muhammad, who's this, and the question that was put to her was, how many female imams are there in the Muslim in Britain? And she said, my organization is a spiritual organization. But they said, well, they're female priests and they're female rabbis. So how many female imams are they? I mean, the real answer, of course, there are no priests or rabbis in the Muslim community that I know of. And I doubt there are many rabbis and priests in any Muslim community. But it's the idea there's an equivalence, but more importantly, that you can read from the experience of what is now constructed as the West, all other experiences.
Yeah. I don't know whether I see there are other questions. Sami Zemnier, one of the co-organizers of this series, who asks, can only Muslims decolonize Islam? If not, why? Wouldn't that diminish the universal dynamic and dimensions of decolonization? If yes, can all Muslims do so, or a specific type of Muslim?
Well, I think it all depends on what you mean by Muslim in the first place. So I would say that anyone can help, and anyone can decolonize and be involved in decolonization. The question is this: what is being decolonized? So that I think is an issue. Often the projects of decolonizing Islam can also can be very antithetical to Muslimness. So it's not a question. Well, for example, Mustafa Kemal and many of the modernizers of the Arab countries and many other parts of the world, they were all anti-colonial. So and they thought that they were trying to decolonize their countries. But the decolonization of their countries, for example, meant turning mosques into warehouses, or changing the language, or demanding westernization as a marker of liberation. Now that, so I
and
think
other
that's
types of oppression.
Yeah. And I think that's also an issue there. For example, in some of the Gulf countries, they have managed to franchise the Louvre, but they destroy their own any kind of cultural production or artistic expression, which doesn't go through the perimeter of the Louvre, kind of thing. So this, so let's be clear about that as well. But no, I don't think decolonization is only a Muslim thing. I just think it happens that Muslims are involved in it for completely historical reasons at this moment in time.
But what is then a Muslim?
Well, now this is getting theological on me, Nadia. You know that.
I mean, I don't need. I mean, you're not a sheikh, so I'm not expecting a theological answer from you. But you said very intriguingly, it depends of what you consider a Muslim.
Surely, a Muslim is someone who submits to the truth.
Yeah.
Isn't that enough?
Yeah. And whatever that truth is.
No. This is a question for sheikhs.
Yeah.
Neither of us qualify.
Yeah, no, I didn't ask. I didn't mean in the theological sense.
I know,
of the word.
but I
Yeah.
think what I was trying to get at was this is why I prefer to use the category of Muslimness rather than a Muslim, because Muslim suggests someone who's a finished product of something, whereas I think that's not the case. Yeah.
I see Kautar who asks another question. So she says, we're very drawn to literature and resistance literature from Latin America, but they are not Muslims. So I think the broader question is like this kind of convergences that exist between the decolonial movement as it manifests itself in Latin America, and I think the critical Muslim studies also summer school that you have been organizing also with Ramon Grosfoguel, who comes from that tradition of thinking decoloniality from a Latin American perspective, is a clear example of that. Can you say something more about that?
I think this is, well, there are two things. One, for example, how many people in your audience know about the slave rebellions in Brazil involving Muslims, or the role of Muslims in the rebellions throughout the Americas? Not because they were, there are reasons for that. So that's a lost history as well. So one of the projects I have on time, and I don't know if I'll do it, is this kind of thing about the forgotten ummah, that there are these kinds of episodes and moments all over the world, that we just do not know about. They don't enter our narrative. So when we talk about Islam and Muslims, we tend to fixate upon South Asia and West Asia and maybe sometimes North Africa, and that's it. We don't talk about Timbuktu. We don't talk about Indonesia. We don't talk about them as normally. So that's the first thing. I think with the Latin American tradition, I think the issue about the Latin American tradition, it goes back to 1492. I think, firstly, I think we can learn from anyone, and I think we should. And I think this whole experience of colonialism is global. But if you accept that colonialism is global, therefore decoloniality must be global. The problem comes in when, how does decoloniality structure itself around the Islamicate? So if you start with 1492 as with the fall of Granada and the conquest of the Americas, how do you explain 1453 when the Muslims captured Constantinople, the capital? Yeah. How do you explain that the fact that what motivates the expulsion and the genocide or virtual genocide of Muslims in Iberia, in Spain, is the fear of Muslim armies liberating them from Africa? It's a very, very different problematic. How do you explain Fanon, who is one of the main kind of, very important thinker and a major influence on a lot of decolonial thought? How do you explain his attitudes to the Islamicate in the Algerian Civil War? How do you explain the fact that he translates many things as being peasant traditions, which have always existed, and kind of forgets to mention that Islamicate layer, which actually anyone would recognize? So there are many, many kind of, how do you manage the fact that the rebel, the leader of the rebels in one of the Brazilian rebellions, took the name Bilal, became rebellion, and someone says, well, that's not really important why he did that. So these are, now in that sense, I think there is a kind of a very, very fruitful conversation to be had about the globality of decoloniality. What does it mean for the Indosphere, the Islamosphere, the Sinosphere? Or is it something which is simply predicated on indigeneity and particular readings of the kind of Atlantic world? So I think that's, but I'm not sure that was the question that was asked, but at least that's the answer I'll give.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know whether there are any other questions, but I did have a question about the way in which CMS, Critical Muslim Studies, emerged as a tradition, and the kind of way in which people have been drawn to you could say, CMS. And when we look at UK from the European perspective, for me at least, personally also, even though I'm aware of problems, etc., But also for the sake of the conversation, I'm just gonna make that
Sure.
point. I mean, it emerges as an oasis, you could say, of intellectual openness and plurality, yeah? Especially considering what's going on now in continental Europe and in France. I don't know whether you have followed the latest development in France, where the Minister of Higher Education, Frédérique Vidal, said that she would commission an investigation at the CNRS in order to examine the degree of Islamo-leftism, Islamo-gauchism in the universities, referring to decoloniality, critical race studies, intersectionality. And before that, there had been already several, you could say, very harsh statements taken by also other officials, and attempts even at inscribing, you could say, the regulation of these types of discourses, and not just discourses, but also fields of research, and to circumvent them. And thankfully, the CNRS has replied today. I just saw yesterday. I don't know whether you saw the CNRS's reply, but they wrote a communiqué, and the title was "Islamo-gauchisme is not a scientific term." So it's not a word. Basically, it's not a scientific concept, and they basically really distant themselves from this development. So I think I have two questions. So when we look from this continent part of the world, you could say, and especially the Francophone and the French context, which is, I think, worse than Belgium, or than I think the Netherlands. The Netherlands also had some moment of thinking whether the universities were too left. It also had its own moment. For us, the UK, I mean, like fields like critical Muslim studies emerges as you could say, as impossible to think of in the European continent, and also the kind of epistemological liberties and audacities that are taken almost to a certain extent. I was evaluating also a dissertation by Amin al-Yusfi, where there is a very clear, you could say, introduction of the Islamic epistemology in the sociological narrative and understanding and analysis to a certain extent, which I find quite amazing and quite refreshing, but which is hard to find, you could say, in the continental context. So are we, maybe, of course, we are idealizing, I'm very well aware, but maybe you could say something about that, and also how you look at the developments in Europe.
But let me ask you a question. Why do you think Belgium and France aren't more like UK in these matters? Let me just
return. That's not fair. I mean, I'm here to ask questions.
No, but I think it's a dialogue, because
no, I think of course you can ask me that question. I mean, I think, again, I would make the difference between France and the Francophone intellectual sphere and the Flemish intellectual sphere or academic sphere, which is, I mean, quite non-existent, because the Flemish academic scene is very much tuned into the Anglo-Saxon scene, or the Euro-Anglo scene, you could say. People in Flemish universities don't publish as much in Dutch, so they have mostly massively resorted to publishing in English. And if they write in Dutch, it's often in op-eds and in the media. So we have a very big gap between the knowledge that is produced in academia and the knowledge that circulates in the media, that is very politicized, you could say, and that is very much ideologized to a certain extent. And I think we have a responsibility also in that regard. I think we are also, I think we have also erred in just leaving away or leaving the intellectual space, or the Dutch-speaking intellectual space in that way. But to come back to your question, I mean, I think probably every country has its own limits. I think what plays in France is and the Francophone scene is the tradition of positivism that is very, very strong, and that has a very clear understanding about what science is, and positivism, not just in the scientific sense, but also positivism is embodied in specific bodies and in specific traditions. I think the first scene that we saw is a clear testimony to that. But I also think that France has a very difficult relationship with allowing for differences to exist in the public and intellectual sphere, right? Whether it's gender differences, whether it's religious differences, whether it's cultural differences. I think it's also interesting that we see that the backlash is on intersectionality. It's not on feminism studies, because France has its generation of feminists that are completely co-opted to the Republican values, and the Elisabeth Badinter's, the Catherine Deneuve's, those kind of feminists that are like, okay, Me Too is bullshit, excuse me the term. While intersectionality does something else, is really challenging that kind of contract, if you want, that white feminists have concluded with the Republican ideals. And I think that's a bit what decoloniality and critical race studies and intersectionality are challenging. They're challenging that Republican contract. But that's my take.
I think that's. I think that's very, very rich. I mean, the only thing I would add to this is perhaps two things. One is that we should not be complacent. Before the election of Trump, many would have said, or many people in the UK said, well, things are wonderful in the United States compared to Britain, because America's a big country, and in the archipelago of American universities, you could find a lot more, the critical mass among really critical scholarship, etc. there. Many of the major academics of color have to leave Britain to go to the United States to thrive. For example, Tala Lasad is actually a very good example of that, but there are many others. I can mention Barnard Hesse, Ben Carrington. I mean, there are people I know, but there are others that you could mention it there that, so there's also a certain kind of dimension. I know that, when young Salman was growing up, that the idea that France might be the place where was, these things were possible. So it's a kind of a different kind of configuration. I think fundamentally what we are witnessing is probably a crisis of white supremacy, which is global. And in that sense, the distance between the different configurations of it are very, very situational. So if you remember when Trump was elected, Macron and Merkel were considered to be the last bastions of the liberal world order. Macron was a centrist. As soon as Trump leaves, in a sense, there is not all the policies that are coming out of France, even Trump wouldn't consider them to be problematic. I mean, in the sense that, look, when Le Pen criticizes you for being Islamophobic, you are really going beyond something, So I think the real issue, it seems to me, ultimately is the one of the strength of the various Muslim communities, which is not to do with their political, it's not to do with the demographic weight, but it is to do with the way that they have been able to translate that temporarily into a political weight. And I think there's arguments to be made that the Muslim community in Britain has, for a variety of reasons, been politically one of the strongest minorities, probably compared to the United States and other places. And that is one of the kind of balances which has opened up these spaces. But I think it would be very dangerous for the Muslim community in Britain or elsewhere to imagine that's a permanent condition rather than a condition that has to be fought off for. Because yes, you're right. In many ways, you can do critical Muslim studies because no one sees it as being significant. But Britain also brings the world prevent. So so I think it's a kind of a mixed thing. But the real issue really is this: that to create that space it's important that Muslims and other peoples of the global South recognize their own strength and the need for them to articulate that strength.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is a real crucial matter. And I think one of the issues is the end of the Cold War and the anti-colonialist movement bringing apart is that at a global level, there isn't any force or articulation in a sustained manner of a narrative that puts into check these kinds of tendencies at a political, cultural level. And that's why I think, production like this, which is trying to do cultural work to translate the cultural and the political and the epistemological, is so important. Because it's really, there is a culture war going on there, and Muslims are caught in the middle of it. And this is why we need to recognize that this is not a war that we necessarily chose, but we are here. And we will be caught in it either way. So we might as well be effective in putting together something different, which doesn't lead to the eradication of Muslimness.
Okay. Thank you for those words, and I think what you're saying is also last point about the importance of cultural work, and I think the work that Ras Al Hanout has been doing here is quite amazing. I mean, this is the first
Absolutely.
time I'm attending or participating, you could say, in this kind of experiment, and it's actually quite inspiring to see the work that has been done and how you could say quite, and I can say that to you. I mean, we know each other quite long, but dense and complicated intellectual work, and to make it accessible to a wider audience and to translate it in a creative manner. And I think I would really like to thank Ras Al Hanout for this and for the work that they're doing.
I would share your sentiments in every single way. I think they've done a fantastic job, and I think they have turned something which was clay into something which is kind of really marble, and I think that's a really great achievement. So in the sense that the artistic production is always better than the reality, and I think they've demonstrated that with their productions. So it's really, really fantastic work.
So I'm looking at time. I think we are about slowly nearing the end. I don't know whether there are any other questions amongst the audience before we conclude. We still have, I see Kautar who writes, I would like to, we invite Mr. Salman to organize annual colloquiums of Reorient in Molenbeek in order to analyze the situation in continental Europe. Inshallah. So,
Inshallah.
Yeah, and
I think, look, we've already Nadia. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm giving away any secrets, but Nadia and I have talked about various ways of doing that, and it's something that I think is really, really important. And I would certainly want to support anything like this.
Yes, I see there is another question that has been asked by Iman Lishkar. Maybe you could address it very briefly.
Sure.
She asks whether ethnographic work on Muslimness can be part of the critical Muslim studies.
Very briefly, yes, but it depends what it's. But it depends on how it's done and what it's doing. I think ethnographic work, which is simply a exercise in voyeurism, perhaps not. Ethnographic work, which is emancipatory and wants to talk about particular kind of experiences, of course. But it really depends on how it's done and what it's done for.
Yeah. I think this is something that we as anthropologists and ethnographers, of course, always struggle with. Like, how do we, and not just on Muslimness, but in general, I think most anthropologists who try to do anthropology otherwise are struggling with how can we do ethnography without reproducing these voyeuristic gazes, without objectifying, you could say, the people we work with, in particular when the researcher is also Muslim. How can we not talk about Muslims as others, but very much implicate ourselves, you could say, in that experience and talk about these lived experiences? I think, I mean, if I can also second what you say, I think the strength of ethnography can be, to go back to what you said, to document and archive other ways of doing and other ways of thinking and imagining the world otherwise, right? In a way that we could not even, and I think that's always the strength for me of ethnography, that I can't even imagine like certain like realities to exist, and the way in which people grapple with their realities that we can learn from. And this amazing creativity of people to renegotiate their lived circumstances and conditions. And I think that can be a very powerful tool if we want to reimagine society otherwise. So
absolutely. I mean, the danger of ethnography, of course, is something like the Human Terrain Project, where anthropology just becomes a branch of imperialism, and the associations and the mapping out simply becomes a way of breaking that. So I think in the world of countering violent extremism or whatever, there's always that the production of that data to be used in those ways, and I think that's always going to be a risk.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, thank you so much, Salman, for your time, for also playing along with this particular experiment that we have proposed to you. And thank you so much also to the audience. Merci beaucoup pour votre présence et pour votre pour être là et pour écouter aussi, pour vos questions. I will now give the word back to Sohaila and Joachim, maybe, who will conclude this session. Merci beaucoup.
Just thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi again. Bonjour, bonsoir plutôt. C'est un peu la nuit en ce moment. J'espère que vous avez apprécié l'expérience autant que nous. C'était une première et on espère qu'on pourra continuer comme ça pas très longtemps parce qu'on espère que la pandémie s'arrête et qu'on puisse enfin se voir en face à face, mais le temps qu'il faudra.
Oui, donc ce soir, on avait eu la chance d'avoir une conversation avec Nadia Fadil et Salman Saïd, mais prochainement, on aura Maysoun Soukariye et Shirin Amir Moazemi avec Sami Zemni et Iman Leshkar aussi. Donc, regardez un œil sur les médias sociaux de Ras El Hanout et vous serez au courant de la prochaine Ras TV.
En mars, bientôt. Yes. Sachez que vous allez nous revoir encore et encore, pour votre plus grand plaisir, bien sûr. Bonne soirée à tous. Au revoir.
Bonne soirée.